Well, hello there. How are you doing? I just want to start by saying that while I launch into this, I think maybe you can start taking some deep breaths, slow inhales, hold it, and then slow exhales. And wait, why is she starting this way? That's weird. Because let's be honest, if you just clicked on the link for a video that's called Write Your MBA Applications in Only a Week, then there's a very good chance that something has gone awry. Uh, whether it was something that was beyond your control, maybe there was a health crisis, or maybe you got laid off recently, you lost your job, and you're suddenly frantically trying to put that MBA application together, or maybe it was completely under your control, but you just really, really wanted to watch that Netflix show. I get it. But so either way, you are probably pretty stressed out right now. So while I get my presentation going, just go ahead and start taking those deep breaths. So I am ready to, there we go. All right. So the nice folks at GMAT Club have asked me to talk today about how you can write an application in only 1 week. And I just want to make it very clear that, uh, you know, the good news is we've got some good news. The good news is that writing your MBA application in 1 week cannot, in fact, cause a slow and painful death. However, I do have to warn you that it can cause a swift and painful rejection. This is not, do not take this presentation as like Maria I really think that it's a great idea to wait for a week. This is more like a triage session where we are going to talk about like, okay, this is not a great situation to be in, but given that this is the situation that you are in, what can we do to try to mitigate things? My first bit of advice, if you've only got a week to write your application, is to maybe consider just waiting and applying in a future round. So, and I know sometimes I say this to people and they're like, oh, but I can't wait for the future round, Maria. The next round, with every round that goes by, there are fewer and fewer and fewer spots left. That's true. But if you get to sort of the end of the week and you're looking at your materials and you're thinking, oh, this is rough, this is in bad shape, it's better maybe to wait for a later round where there are fewer spots, but what you're submitting is stronger, as opposed to making you kind of dead on arrival. At least you have a fighting chance if you submit something that's a little bit stronger. Now, if you are in a situation where you have to start that MBA program as soon as possible, right? Let's say it's the final round, typically round 3, round 4, and you, for whatever reason, have decided that you have to go. I have to start my studies in August or in January for INSEAD or different programs. Then I get it. But I just want to warn you that I think you do have to realistically be ready to maybe make some compromises in terms of which program you are targeting. So, for example, yes, it's true. The final round has the fewest number of seats of all, especially if you are from an overrepresented group in the applicant pool. By that, I mean normally engineers, management consultants, people in finance, etc. And if you really are in a place of urgency, like don't necessarily say like, well, I'm really desperate to start, and so I'm targeting Stanford and Wharton and Booth. Just realize like if you really are, either you really are in a state of urgency, in which case I would suggest that you maybe look at programs that have a 50% plus acceptance rate, for example, or one in which your GMAT score might be 50 plus points above their average, or perhaps they have like one of those test waiver options, which more and more schools have been doing, which means you don't necessarily have to submit a test score at all, or you don't have to submit it when you apply, and they may ask you for one later on. That is something that might that you might be able to take advantage of depending on the school. So if you've only got a week left and you're sort of just getting started, maybe look for a school that is not perhaps as hard to get into. And the reason I advocate this is that I want you to think about, keep your eyes on the prize as to why it is that you are doing this application. Why are you even looking for an MBA anyway? If part of that is you want to change careers kind of as soon as possible, right? You've been an engineer now for 4 years, 6 years, and you're done with it. You don't want to do it anymore. I get it. So if that's the case, I say this a lot. The school does not make the person makes the school. So it is possible for very smart, very driven people to go to a second rate, third rate, 20th rate school and get out of that MBA program and kick tons of butt. On a more pragmatic level, if you are an international student trying to get into the US or trying to go to the EU or UK, a lot of programs, not just the very tippy top ones, can in fact give you those work authorization options. So in the US, if an MBA program is designated as sort of STEM designated, that then gives you an option for something called the OPT work authorization. Basically, it gives you up to 3 years to then work in the United States afterwards. So I get it that like, okay, but Maria, you don't understand. It's always been my dream to go to Wharton. I understand that, but given the pragmatic situation you're in, you might have to perhaps look for a program that's easier to get into, because I really do want to help you guarantee that you are maximizing your chances. I do also want to mention, though, one final issue. If you are applying in the final round, there's really hard to get a seat at all. But if you do get a seat, getting scholarship money is even harder at that point. So if you're in a situation where you have to get that scholarship money or it's not going to happen, you cannot go, again, all the more reason, look for programs where, for example, your GMAT score is way above that school's average, because that's going to make you more appealing to them and more likely that you get accepted, and that also you get a scholarship. Now, just to avoid some last minute heart attacks before you sprint and take off on this week of stress, just make sure that you're qualified to actually apply. A few things that have tripped people up in the past, in my experience: some MBA programs in the US do require that you have a test like the TOEFL, or one of these tests that demonstrate your fluency in the English language. Different schools have different recommendations or requirements. So some will say, if you went to a university that was taught in English, we don't care. And some will say, we don't, even if you went to a university that was taught in English, then you have to take the TOEFL, or you don't have to take the TOEFL. While some schools may not, well, they never really issue sort of a GMAT score level. In other words, a business school will almost never say, if your GMAT score is below a 650, don't even bother. They might not say that, but some schools actually do issue these kind of cutoffs for the TOEFL. So just make sure, if you're applying to Harvard Business School and they say we require, or we strongly suggest that you have at least a 109 on the TOEFL, and you have an 89 on the TOEFL, maybe don't even bother applying, because sorry, but your application is probably not really going to be considered. Also, another thing that trips people up from other countries, in particular folks from Europe and some folks from India, I'm looking at you. Some business schools will not take you or they will not consider your application if you have a 3-year bachelor's degree versus a 4-year bachelor's degree. And similarly, if you already have an MBA from your home country, some schools are like, yeah, we're fine with it, we're cool. But other schools will say, you know what, we really want to be the first and primary MBA experience someone has. So just check these things out. And also, if you are applying from a country where it is traditionally difficult to perhaps get a student visa from your country, you might just want to call the admissions office and ask. So let's say, hypothetically, you're applying in round 3, and you are from a country that has, if you're from a country where like, oh, you just waltz into the US and it's no big deal, then okay. But if you're from a country where it might be more challenging, honestly, just maybe call the admissions office and say, hey, I'm from country X. I'm thinking of applying in round 3. Like, honestly, if I were to get in, would I get the student visa in time? Because if they think that you're not going to get the student visa in time, and therefore letting you in is an exercise in futility for all parties involved, you either might not get in, or you might get in and then womp womp. Unfortunately, you might not be able to actually enroll. So with those sort of checks out of the way, let's assuming that you've checked all those things out and now you're like, okay, I can apply to this school. I found some schools that I think are a good fit. Okay, so the first step that I want you to look at is for your recommenders. Okay, so the bad news about recommenders is that you cannot get them to pull an all-nighter. You might find yourself having to pull an all-nighter this week. And you can make yourself do that, but you cannot make your recommender do that. So that's the bad news. That's why I want the first thing to do, if you're really just getting started in this process and you've only got like a week, I want you to like even pause. If you're watching this as a post-recorded session after the fact, pause this right now and reach out to your 1 or 2 recommenders and just say like, hey, I'm applying to business school. It's in a week. Like, are you even up for recommending me. The good news, though, is that a lot of schools do have a grace period. That is to say, if a deadline is on, let's say, March 1st, and your stuff has to be in by that deadline. But if your recommender takes an extra day or two, oftentimes that is it might be sort of over. You might be sort of forgiven or treated with a bit of grace. Now, assuming that you've got your recommenders ready to go, the next question I have for you is like, okay, did you already tell them which stories you want them to use in the recommendation? Because if that's the case, remember, for the recommendation, you normally need at least two stories for your recommenders to tell. One, a story in which you were a successful leader and you accomplished something that other people had not been able to, or you exceeded the expectations of your job, or whatever that sort of triumphant story is. And two, most recommendations ask for a time that they had to give you negative feedback. And how did you respond to that? And then that is essentially a way of asking for a failure. And how do you deal with setbacks, failures, and criticism? So if you've already figured out, like, okay, I want this recommender to talk about this story, or this other recommender to talk about this other story, great. Then use this week, like right now, I want you to gently follow up with them and say, hey, how's it going, friend? This deadline's coming up and I could really use your help. Now, if you have not even started contacting your recommenders and trying to gently guide them as to what they are going to say about you, we need to take a step back, and it's story time. So what I mean by that is the first thing you need to do, if you don't even have your recommender set up yet, is you need to start thinking about what stories are you going to use in your application to prove to the admissions committee that you're the sort of person that they are in fact looking for. So here's the good news, is that you can brainstorm a couple of different types of stories, and you can sort of use them across even perhaps more than one school's application. Because a lot of the easier schools, their applications usually have sort of, you might need, let's say, 1 to 3 leadership stories. And just as a reminder, if you haven't seen any of my presentations before, by leadership stories, I mean anything that showing amazing emotional intelligence. This is not about, I was so smart and I came up with the numeric answer that made everyone else weep with joy at my quantitative prowess. It is more about you being able to influence others, motivate others, etc. So that's what I mean by a leadership story. And even so much the better, if you are applying to business school with a specific type of career goal, if possible, try to make that leadership story be something that ties into the future career goal, even if indirectly. Because that way, when I'm reading your application and you say, well, I want to go to business school because I want to work in brand management or whatever it is, I can at least sort of picture like, okay, this makes sense, right? This person at least has, maybe they don't have the direct experience that they need to get that job after business school, but they've got the ingredients, the raw ingredients that we can use at our school to mold them into a brand manager or what have you. If you haven't yet started your recommendation journey, then you're going to need, like I mentioned a second ago, at least one leadership story per recommendation needed. Now, the good news is some schools only need one recommendation, which is which is very nice for applicants. And in fact, I think USC, when I think of like sort of the top sort of 20-ish schools, USC does not require any recommendations. So something to keep in mind. Now, if you are a career switcher, I also want you to think about at least one piece of evidence that you can use in your application to show that you've done your career homework. And by that, I mean, have you even looked to see if the career path that you are proposing is even a viable one, right? If you are 47 years old and you have never stepped foot on a trading floor, and you've never even traded a stock in your life, and you don't know what a derivative is, then maybe if you're going to then say, I want to go to business school because I suddenly have decided I want to become an asset manager, realize that the onus is going to be on you. It's going to be a very heavy onus on you to show, like, actually, I spoke to 7 different asset management firms and all of them said that they would hire me. You then have to make that argument to them. And again, if you have not yet thought about your recommenders, you're going to need at least one failure story for each recommendation. And not just a time that you failed, but a time that then after that failure, you picked yourself up and you either learned something from it, you kept going, you demonstrated tenacity, or you then improved as a result. So the good news is that if you just sort of take a step back and think through, like, okay, I've got my sort of 3 leadership stories, my 1 career homework story, and a failure story, then you can sort of puzzle piece those together and use them for different schools' applications. So maybe your original plan was to, I'm just going to apply to this one school with the time I have left. Maybe you might be able to knock out a couple more applications if the essays are similar. And at the top, just to clarify, when I said an easy application, I meant the sorts of schools that tend to focus primarily on a statement of purpose type of essay, right? Tell us about your career vision and why you need our school to get there, right? Schools with, say, 6 essays, like Stanford, obviously, the more essays or the more essay questions a school has, the more of these you'll have to brainstorm. ApplicantLab users, if you have not already checked out the brainstorming module, because if you're sort of like blanking, you're like, I don't know, I don't have any brainstorming story or any leadership stories, jump over to that brainstorming module and I will help you there. Okay, so if you still have not yet gone to your recommenders, so before you start your own essays, what you're going to say about yourself, since you need to get them going and started, allocate one leadership story and one failure story to each one of them, and then create a document for them. Don't just say, well, I'm applying to business school, thanks. But I actually want you to create either it's a document or it's an email where you say, okay, you're going to be asked about how I compare to my peers. How does my performance compare to my peers? Obviously, you're going to hopefully say something nice about me. You're going to say that I'm really, really good compared to my peers. And when you say that, please use, right, remember the time that I jumped in and I led that project when no one else wanted to do that. I want you to actually, when you write to your recommender, actually explain to them which story you want them to use, which aspects of your leadership in that situation you want them to highlight, right? You cannot write your own recommendation. That is technically forbidden. Yes, you might be able to get away with it, but it is, especially if you're in a hurry and you don't have time to then kind of massage the writing and the language to make it sound like it's 2 or 3 different people writing here. It's a lot easier to tell. It's pretty obvious sometimes when people have written their own applications and then they also write the recommendation. It's more obvious than you might think it is if you haven't been spending the past 20 years looking at many applications. So what I recommend is try to guide them with friendly suggestions, but don't try to write it for them unless if it is a risk. Now, if you are watching this and you are an ApplicantLab user, if you go to the recommendations module, I do have like a little template for that document that you can send to your recommenders, just to save you a little bit of time in terms of guiding you on what you might want to ask them to say or not say. Whew, so, okay, we've got the recommenders. They're out of the way. They are doing this work in parallel. So now that you know that they're kind of on their way, now it's time for you to focus on your actions and what you're going to do to create this application. So you're going to need kind of 3 big buckets of writing. One is the resume. The resume is more important than the essays. The essays, this is the thing that people tend to obsess over the essays, and the essays are certainly important, but they're not as important as the resume. And then the third thing that a lot of people don't necessarily stop to think about are the application forms themselves. I do not want you to wait until the last minute to start to fill out the application form. More on that in a second. Okay, so the resume. Why, of all the things I think you should start with, if you only have for every marginal hour of time you've got between now and submission, your biggest ROI, like your return on investment, in other words, the biggest bang for your buck, is going to come from working on that resume. And why is this? Well, first of all, the resume is the first document that is like really read. Like, when I go through applications, I might sort of skim the first part, but the thing where I think a lot of admissions readers have said that they do this for obvious reasons, is the first thing you really focus in on is that resume. And when you think about it, it makes sense because the resume is really kind of like your sheet of your greatest hits, right? Maria's greatest hits. Here they are all on one page. Ta-da. And so in terms of demonstrating to them that you really are this, above average leader, go-getter who makes things happen and gets things done. The resume is going to be the thing that shows them that, yes, this person has the level of accomplishments, the level of achievement that we look for in people in our class. The resume is also really important because it provides the context against which the actions described in the essays happen, right? I'm not going to read an essay first before I read a resume, or at least before I have some sense of where does this person work? What do they do? Kind of a general set. Because if I just jump right into an essay and the essay is like, well, here's a time I was a leader. Here's a time that I was a champion for diversity and inclusion. Here's a time that I did X and Y. If I don't at least have a basic idea of like, well, wait, what do they even do? And what? It's going to be really confusing, right? So the resume is really important for providing that context. Also, I have seen personally that a really strong resume can forgive a slightly weaker essay. But the vice versa doesn't happen. So if you submit this stellar essay, but your resume is kind of boring, or your resume kind of makes you look like you're sort of a low level, someone who really isn't entrusted with a lot of responsibility, or someone, you haven't had a promotion in 5 years, like, ugh. If your resume sort of paints a negative picture, a really, really good essay it's possible that it will rescue you, but it's unlikely to rescue you. So as a side note, resume advice is out there. I have done a resume webinar with GMAT Club that you can find. And if you're an ApplicantLab user, in the resume module, I have like the checklist. So if you're like, oh, I know she's got that resume module, but whew, there's like 40 zillion steps in it. If you're really, really, really in a hurry, you can kind of skip the steps, go to the checklist at least for you to check your own resume and see if it's hitting the right notes. And then if it isn't, if there's something on that checklist that you're like, oh, actually, my resume doesn't do this. Oh no, don't worry. Then just go back to that section of the resume module. But at least that's a way to save some time. Not ideal. We are not in an ideal situation, but at least a way to try to get some guidance, even if you are very, very short on time. All right. Then I kind of want you to jump over to the application forms, and I want you to be working on the application forms here and there throughout this week or however much time you've got. Primarily because there is a lot of stuff to fill out. Before you actually jump into the application form, or if you just jump in a very cursory way, you might look at it and think, yeah, whatever. It's like it asks for my name and my address and my date of birth and my, the language. Okay, fine, whatever. The thing is, most MBA application forms have a lot of little tiny boxes in them. Sometimes those text boxes aren't even visible at first. Sometimes those text boxes, you fill in something in the application form and then whoop, it suddenly opens a bunch of extra text boxes that weren't even on the screen until you filled in this one piece over here. So the sorts of stuff you might have to fill out. Job description, responsibilities, what's your greatest accomplishment or your greatest accomplishments at work? What challenges have you had to overcome at work? Obviously, every school has slightly different things, but this is the kind of thing you might encounter. If you've been unemployed for 3 months or more, you have to explain what you did during that time. Some schools might say, use this little box here to describe for us your international experience. What have been your major experiences working with other cultures or living overseas? So here's the thing. Yes, in an absolute pinch, if you have a box on accomplishments or job responsibilities, yeah, can you just sort of copy and paste what you've written in the resume and plonk it bloop, right into the application form? You can. However, nothing screams, I waited until the last minute to fill this out, than somebody just copying and pasting like word for word what's in the resume. So I want you to try to at least rewrite your job description or what have you, rewrite it so it's not just copied and pasted from something else, just because it makes it, obviously if it's if you submit this application and it's incredibly obvious that you only spent a week on it, that's not great. So I'm giving you some of this advice so that to try to cover up for the reality of the situation. And then also no empty boxes. So again, let's say that it's deadline day and that you look at your watch and you're like, oh my gosh, the deadline is in 3 hours. Spend that time filling in the application forms. At least make sure that every single box is filled out with something. Because if a box is like left out, or let's say, like, for example, you're like, what should she possibly mean by this? Something like, describe your extracurricular activities, for example. Some schools will have the opportunity for, if you sort of leave that blank, it doesn't look good, first of all, in general. And second of all, it looks like, oh, this person really hurried. Those extra 3 hours that you spend, let's say, I don't think it should take all 3 hours to do the application form, but I'm saying the time that you spend between now and hitting submit, filling in the application form and making sure that it is completely filled out is better than the marginal benefit you're going to get from revision number 27 of the essays. So yeah, try not to leave out any empty boxes. Try to do the application forms, get started on them. You might even want to get started on them today. Another thing that I often advise is, if you are sort of neck deep in resume and essay, sometimes filling in the application form can feel like a little bit of like a break, a little bit of a palate cleanser in between those heavier pieces of writing that you have to do. So I know it's not much of a break. It's not I didn't say it was a fun break, but it could be sort of a mental break if you need to, take a few minutes to try something different or to focus on something different. So the essay or essays, of the three elements that I've got on the screen right now, I believe that the essay is the most sort of forgivable of the three. Now, to be clear, please don't, Maria said that it's okay to submit a terrible essay. That's weird. No, I'm not saying that you should do a bad job on the essays, but I'm saying that of the elements where it's sort of the 80-20 rule is the most likely to apply, I do believe it is the essay for a couple of reasons. Number one, because most essays ask you to talk about let's say between 1 to 3 events that happened in your life, they're going to sort of more zero in and zoom in on specific moments or specific activities or projects that you worked on, versus the resume, which covers pretty much you from college until today, right? So the amount of examples, the number of examples that are going to go into your resume is much, much greater versus the essays, which more zoom in on one or two things. Number two, the essay is of all the things that are most likely to be skimmed. I mean, everything is probably going to be skimmed on some level, but the essays are the most likely to be skimmed, just because it's walls of text, and admissions readers are humans like me and you. I know, shocking, but it's true. They are humans, and you would probably skim if you had to read 20 essays a day. You might start to skim them. I believe that they do as well. And then finally, think about the goal of the written application is to get invited to that interview stage, right? You just need to clear. That's the main thing, right? You got to clear it to get invited to that interview. At the interview, they will ask you for more examples. You will probably get in an interview. Tell me about your greatest achievement. Tell me about a time you failed. Tell me about a time that you championed for someone who was being mistreated, whatever that question is. So you're going to get other opportunities to tell those spotlight stories in the interview if you get to the interview. So I'm not saying to do a bad job on the essays. Please don't make that. Oh, Maria said that. No, I'm just saying of the three things. And also because, like I said a second ago, in my experience, when I find people that are like, I'm on version number 27 I'm on edit number 32, the marginal returns of each edit that you do on your essays gets less and less and less and less. It's really, at a certain point, if it's a semicolon versus a dash versus a colon versus an ellipsis, like it's fine. It's the substance that matters a lot more in the essay, as opposed to the style. Now, if you have jumped into ApplicantLab before, you might have seen that I have a ton of essay advice, right? I have sort of the step-by-step way to build it, ingredient by ingredient, brick by brick. But given that you probably don't have time to go through all of that advice right now, here's kind of like my highest return on investment advice, or where I think you should best allocate what little time you have left to at least get the biggest bang for your buck. Okay, number one, do not put any jargon in your essays. If you work in oil and gas or manufacturing or software coding, please don't start talking about the whatever, the PSI of the refractory. I'm literally making words up that I don't even know if those are real words. Don't start talking about the technical aspects of your job. Remember, admissions readers are often themselves not businessy people, and they are frequently people with sort of an HR, human resources type of bent. They are not often people who themselves have worked in engineering. They themselves have not usually worked in finance or what have you. So if you haven't already seen my resume webinar, just keep that in mind. Keep their backgrounds in mind, your audience in mind. They're not going to know the technical jargon of your work. And don't emphasize, I mentioned this before, I just want to hit this point again. When you're trying to think about, okay, what am I going to, I've got 500 words, I've got 300 words. What am I going to talk about in this essay when I think about telling them the story that I want them to know about me? Don't spend a lot of time, if any time, proving to them that you're smart. Because the job that I am hiring you for as an admissions reader is I am hiring you to come into my school, number one, in the short term, to be an amazing student and classmate that everyone's going to love in the short term. And number two, in the long term, to graduate and go out and do amazing stuff and accomplish amazing things to make the school proud. Right. And so those sorts of things neither one of those things necessarily is, dependent upon your ability to sort data in your head or to memorize 10-digit numbers or whatever it is. So focus on your leadershipy actions and those EQ insights. The second bit of pragmatic advice that I've got, make sure that you're writing about your first person actions. What did I do? Not we. Because when you describe in your essay, well, so we went to the client and then we decided that the best thing to do was for us to redo this work for them. We are not applying to business school. You are the one applying to business school. So I need to be able to read that essay and get a sense of what was your role within that specific anecdote that you're telling me. So, for example, as a bad example, I then built a machine learning optimizer in Python that segmented the data and then ran it through a Monte Carlo simulation that optimized the what. Oh my God, how boring is that? Even assuming that the admissions reader knows anything about Python or they've ever had to optimize anything in their lives, there's a very good chance they've never even had to do it. Very good chance they don't know what that means. But even if they do, it doesn't matter. Because in this situation, in this one in red, you're emphasizing skills that I don't care about really. I'm not hiring you to come to my business school and fix my database. That's not the job that you are being hired for, insofar as you can think about applying to business school as applying for a job. The job you are applying for is future alumnus or alumna who's going to make the school proud. So a much better description, if you have to focus on, choose what you're going to focus on in your essay, a much better example. I realized that he didn't object to the idea itself. Instead, what he was really worried about was that he was going to lose his job. With this insight in hand, I reframed the proposal to emphasize how our solution would in fact make him look better in front of his boss instead of replacing him. Delighted with this new angle, he then agreed to the deal. So, a couple of things about this example. Number one, notice how it's I. Yes, I'm using the second, it's our solution, but I was the one who realized that the reason this client was not going for my idea was for our idea was because he thought, oh gosh, if I approve this new software tool, what if it replaces me? So I was the one who had that insight. Notice how I'm focusing on an emotional insight, a psychological insight, and not I realized that the data set was really ugly and had too many duplicates, and so I deduped it. No, what I'm focusing on here is the people aspect of it. And then I reframed the proposal, and that was sort of like the magic moment where the light bulb went off for him and the clouds parted and the rainbow appeared and he said, yes, let's do this deal. I love it. Let's move forward. So those are the two big improvements from the sort of green positive one versus the red one above it. Another thing to keep in mind is because admissions officers read usually hundreds, if not thousands, of applications in any given year. That's the bad news, right? The bad news is they don't have a ton of time to spend digging in lovingly into every square millimeter of your application. They're not going to pull out a magnifying glass and look. That's the bad news, right? The bad news is they're probably going to skim the first time through. Or they're going to try to set like a timer, like, okay, I've got 10 minutes, I've got 20 minutes. That's the bad news. But the good news is you can use this to your advantage. Because if you think about the fact that the admissions officers are reading hundreds, thousands of essays in a year, they've seen a lot of stuff. And the challenges we face at work, no matter where we work, whether we work at a hospital or at an elementary school or on a floating oil rig in the middle of the ocean, challenges that people face at work are pretty much the same right? There's sort of like these buckets of challenges. There's the coworker who wasn't pulling their own weight challenge. There was the very old senior person who didn't want to change the way they did things challenge. There's the boss was not convinced that my risky idea was worth pursuing challenge. So the good news is realizing that they probably have seen maybe not the specific situation you're writing about, but they have seen something similar to it. You then do not have to spend a lot of time describing this whole background of like, as a management consultant, I often have to work with people in the client site. You don't have to get into that. They know what management consultants do. They know that as an engineer, I am often called upon to find solutions. No, I get it. I know that. Right? So the good news is you don't have to go into that stuff. You don't have to go into the IQ stuff. You don't have to go into the background stuff. And then instead of you spending an hour or two of time left as the countdown clock is nearing that deadline, there are so many good online grammar checker tools out there. Like, don't spend 3 hours rereading your own stuff trying to catch your own stuff. Even I, like, it's so hard to catch your own mistakes when you're writing. I can't catch my own mistakes when I'm writing. I probably have had mistakes in these slides that I did not catch. Uh, so it's very hard to do that. So try to run your writing for the essays through some sort of online, not just even a grammar checker, but there's one called Hemingway app that I believe has a free version. And if you're only running a few essays through it, I don't think you have to pay for it, I would think. Hemingway app is one, and there are millions out there to be clear, but Hemingway, for example, is one that not only checks the basics of the grammar and the spelling, but it might say something like, one way to really make your writing more interesting is to vary the sentence length. So if you have one really, really long sentence, maybe follow it up with 3 short sentences, or vice versa. So some of these apps today have gotten so sophisticated that they will actually give you style advice and not just, you misspelled this word. One word of caution though, I know some people have reached out to me and they're like, hey, ChatGPT, it wrote my essay. First of all, I don't know. ChatGPT might be able to write a good essay, but I think that it will not have the kind of humanizing details that will make an essay compelling. And let's say you're like, oh, well, Maria, my friend used ChatGPT in round 1 and they said, and they got interviewed, they got accepted. So clearly you can get away with it. I don't know, because I feel like if the ChatGPT writes your essay in a certain way, and then I interview you later, because don't forget, pretty much every school has an interview portion of it. In fact, more and more and more schools are moving towards the online pre-recorded interview, such that they record a little snippet of you, and then at any moment in the application process, right, if they're in committee, right, at the very end of the selection process, we're like, okay, we've got 10 spots left and who's going to get them? And then they go around the room and people argue and fight over, like, no, take my candidate. No, take my candidate. They can just pull, okay, well, let's just see what they answered for this one interview question that we have the pre-recorded interview for. Boom, they can pull that up. And so if all of a sudden we've got this essay that is written in a very distinct style, but your speaking voice does not match that style, it's going to be pretty clear that something, you either paid someone else to write your essay or you using AI or something like that. So just don't be afraid of using your own voice. And by that, I mean how you would speak normally. Please don't make your essays too formal, too stuffy. That's super boring and it's inauthentic. So don't be afraid to use your own voice. So I do want you to, yes, check your grammar. Yes, vary your sentence length. Yes, make your essay more interesting by putting quotes that someone said. So instead of, he was resistant to the idea, you could instead put, quote, I don't know, Maria, I'm not buying it, he said with a frown on his face. Right, those sorts of details, yes. So use online tools to help you throw in those good details, but don't use an online tool so much that it turns you into a robot. And just again, if you happen to be an ApplicantLab user who has stumbled upon this, you can go to the section where I have the pre-writing, where I take every essay question and I break it down into smaller questions. If you're in a hurry, You don't have to watch. I know I got like, oh, you're like, oh, she's got all this stuff where she analyzes the essay questions and she digs into like what are they really asking? You don't have to do that part if you're in a hurry. Just skip to the pre-writing, the mini questions, and start to fill those out as a place to get started. Not ideal, not recommended. I do not endorse this, but if you are stuck, it is what it is. All right, so moving on to the sort of statement of purpose type of essays. And by that, I mean the essays that are like, um, please explain your career goals and why our school is the place for you to achieve those goals. That sort of thing, right? It's basically asking, why do you want to come to this school, given what you want to do in the future? Tell us what you want to do in the future. And given what you want to do in the future, why do you want to come to this school and not the other 4 million schools that are out there? So, if you're watching this, and if earlier in the presentation when I started talking about that career vision homework, that is to say, the evidence that you can provide if you are applying to business school with a career switching argument, and you're like, I haven't done any of that, then please just play it safe. Submit a safe, quote unquote, safe career vision, right? The less evidence you have that you can make that switch, the less big I want that switch to be. As I often like to quip, it's Harvard, not Hogwarts. Business school cannot magically suddenly turn you from an oil rig engineer into a private equity investor. It in one fell swoop. You have to work your way towards it. So if you apply to business school and you say, well, I want to make this completely unrealistic switch because I think that you guys are wizards and all you have to do is wave the magic wand and I will immediately get any job in the world that I want, you're going to seem unrealistic. And as I have talked about in other videos here at GMAT Club, if you seem like you're going to have unrealistic expectations or make unrealistic demands of the program, ooh, that feels a little risky. So I'm not gonna pursue your candidacy any further. And just as a reminder, your goal right now is just to get accepted. Once you get accepted, then yes, go after whatever it is that floats your boat. Pursue that real estate developer job, even though you've never even built anything in your life. Whatever it is, I don't care. My job is to help you maximize your chances of getting in, and your focus right now should be getting in. And if applying with a complicated or weird career vision is going to get in the way of that, then just don't do it. Apply with a more safer career vision. And moving on then to why this school, you're going to look up, obviously, the classes that are relevant. But I also want you to look up the relevant career-related club, right? So don't forget that business school is not just about the classes, but it can especially if it's a full-time in-person program, it can often have these career, like the real estate club or the healthcare club or the consulting club or the banking club or the whatever club. These clubs are often just as, if not perhaps more important in your career journey than the classes themselves. So don't forget to mention the club. And I want you to go to that club's website and look to see what sorts of resources they mention, what sorts of events they mention. So then that way, when you're writing your statement of purpose essay, you can say something like, the consulting club's 3-week intensive workshop on case interviewing is going to help me land that consulting job, right? That way you're not just saying your school has a consulting club. That's cool. You're actually going a step further and linking what resources that club have that is then going to help you when you are sitting in front of that corporate interviewer trying to get that job. Another thing is that many schools like to see evidence that you have reached out to a current student or have really gotten to know the school. This is because they are worried about yield. They don't want to go through the trouble and the hassle of accepting you, only for you to then be like, nah, I don't know, right? So one of the ways that you prove that you really love a school is you talk to students. Now, if you've only got a week, chances are you're not going to be able to talk to a student, right? Maybe, but if you can, great. But if you can't, the next best thing in terms of things that you might be able to mention in your statement of purpose is look up something like the Student Voices blog, or put the name of the school and then like student profiles, or I actually, student blogs are usually your best source of information. And what's the idea here? The idea is it'll at least give you ideas for things to talk about. in your essay. So you could say something like, let's say I'm looking up, like in this case, Darden UVA MBA Student Voices blog. So I get these results. I know it might be a little small on your screen to see, but it's like blogs.darden.virginia.edu, global voices of Darden, students' perspectives, right? So you click on that at least gives you the URL that gives you a place to start. And then when you click on that, you can then search within the student blog. And let's say I'm interested in consulting, I can at least then pull up the blog posts that talk about consulting. And then that is how I can skim very quickly. Oftentimes, for example, in these student voices blogs, it'll be something like, when asked about what she loved most about Darden, Maria said, the case interview workshop that the consulting club ran was super valuable. So then that way, in your statement of purpose, you mention, I know that the consulting club has a case interview workshop. I've heard, or I've read, or I've discovered that there's a case interview workshop, right? So at least that way, you're not just saying your school is good. I like good school. Good school take me, good school get me job, right? You're actually really personalizing it. So I'm not saying that you should lie and pretend that you've spoken to a student when you haven't, but you can put in those little details and personal touches that at least makes it clear that you've done the research. But this is a way to get some of the, to discover, what's it called? What is that? What do they call it, a workshop? Do they call it a conference? Do they call it a boot camp? Whatever terminology that school uses or that club uses, you can learn this quickly without having to start from scratch. And if you have a specific career interest, you can actually use that as a keyword. So you can look up, if you're using Google, whatever your keyword, let's say it's sustainability or sustainable in : Darden UVA MBA students blog. And then you get, in this case, when I did this, it narrowed it down, and I saw something from Pranita Sadavarte. When asked why UVA and Darden specifically, she had 3 reasons. Hey, that's cool. So if you then click on this and then search on the page reasons, look at this. Now I've gotten directly from a student her 3 reasons for why she wanted to go to Darden. I'm not saying that you should repeat the 3 reasons. I'm certainly not saying that you should say, well, according to Pranita's, no. Again, I'm not saying that you should pretend that you spoke to the student, but at least now for each school, you at least know, what did the students themselves say about the school? So then that way you can mirror those reasons in your statement of purpose to make it clear, or to at least make it seem like, oh yeah, I've spent months researching the school. This is a very, very careful decision that I am making to apply to your school. And similarly, you might suddenly get, oh, look, there's a global MBA summit on climate, capital, and business. So you can click on that, and that might take you to a conference or something that is relevant for you to mention. And then finally, a question that I sometimes get from people who have waited, again, through either no fault of their own or complete fault of their own, people who don't have a lot of time. Should I write in the optional essay just what happened, right? Just sort of explaining to them, look, guys, I honestly, I threw this together in a week. Should I do that? So I have a couple of thoughts here. First of all, if you were planning to apply earlier, so let's say you created your you created your application form. You went to the school's website, you entered in your email, you created that account, you started getting the emails from them. That is an indicator to them that you actually were planning to apply quite a ways back, right? Because they can see the date that you created your account. So you can't suddenly be like, I just got laid off last week and now I suddenly find myself finding to quickly find it. Like, well, wait a minute. Then if that's the case, then why did you create your account last July? So if you were planning to apply, or if the data points to maybe this person was planning to apply earlier and then something got out of control and that's why they waited until now. If something that happened that was not your fault, maybe a health issue, maybe something, you had to leave work for 6 months to take care of an ailing relative, or you yourself had your own medical issue, whatever that is, then I do think you can explain it and just say, this is why I'm applying in round 3. I know I was hoping to apply in round 1 or round 2, but here's why my application is so late. I have also seen this work for people who have job requirements that are super intense that were also not foreseeable. So for example, I have seen this work with people in the military who are suddenly called to be on some sort of mission, in some sort of combat zone. If that's the case, yes, of course, just explain the situation. I got called away to Afghanistan or whatever it was. that is completely understandable. However, if something was just your own fault and you're like, yeah, I ran out of time, or if it was foreseeable, reasonably foreseeable. For example, a big project came up at work and I was too busy because of work. Then maybe just don't don't try to draw attention to the elephant in the room and hope that they don't notice that you put together this application in a week. Especially, I have a severe allergy to the excuse, well, work got really busy for anything. I also hate this excuse when people are like, well, my GMAT score is really low because I was just really busy at work. Mm, I don't know. Business school, the one of the biggest things, if not the biggest thing they use to determine whether or not they're going to accept you is how successful you've been at work. And so if you're saying, well, I had too much work and so I couldn't handle applying, or I couldn't handle taking the GMAT or studying for the GMAT, that's not a good look. Because you're basically saying like, hey, that thing that you're using to judge me and to ascertain how competitive, well, I'm not that good at it. Time management, whew, no, I can don't ask me for that. Like, ooh, that's not great. So in that case, it's actually better to just kind of like not address it, not draw attention to it, and just kind of sweep it under the rug and hope that they don't notice. Now, if applying to business school was in fact not planned, one of the biggest reasons being, for example, unfortunately, in this day and age, the biggest reason being that you were laid off and you suddenly find yourself having to apply, and you think, well, maybe this is a sign that I should maybe get that MBA. And so you start researching how to apply to MBA, and you're like, oh, great, oh, I got a week. Then I think you can absolutely explain it. You can say, I was laid off on this day. The next, I was I was sad for a day. You don't have to say that out loud, but it's understandable if you say, okay, the next day I started thinking about like this is a sign, or this is my chance to go for that MBA. Then I think you can just say, here's the situation, guys. Because no one, to the extent that the layoff is hopefully not your fault, they're not going to be as judgmental. And then you can also say like, look, I get it. I realize that this, you might have to push me off to the next round. I realize that this application may not be currently very competitive because with the haste with which it was created. But at least I'm introducing myself to you. And as a side note, like if you are, kind of on the fence, there might be a variation here where you realize in your head that your chances might be pretty low, but at least the way you can rationalize it to yourself is by saying, well, at least now they're going to know who I am, and they're going to be on the lookout for me when I reapply again 6 months from now, 4 months from now, whatever that time is. Okay, so that is my advice. Click to exit. Okay. Oh, here I am. Oh, I have reappeared. So basically, start with the recommenders because you can't control them. Think about what stories you're going to use. Highlight stories that show you with awesome people skills. Then focus on the resume more than anything. Again, GMAT Club, there's a webinar that I do for resume stuff, or ApplicantLab users. Again, jump into the resume module for those quick tips. And then fill out the application form and the essays, kind of going back and forth between those two. Not ideal. I don't love it, but I also don't love a lot of things that happen in the world. And yet here we are in the world that is very not ideal. So hopefully, at least if you find yourself in this unideal situation, hopefully the steps that I've just given you give you at least a plan, as opposed to feeling like there's a tornado in my head of things to do. And hopefully I've at least tried to sort of quiet that tornado a little to give you step-by-step instructions on how I think you can best divide your time and attack different pieces of things, to hopefully at least try to get you over the finish line and hit submit. All right, with that out of the way, I don't know if there are any questions. Okay. Should the resume be one page, asks Henry, or can it be longer? Henry, most business schools, you must keep it to one page. Some schools will say it can be up to 2 pages, but nobody likes a 2-page resume. Again, put yourself in their shoes. If you were reading 20 applications a day for months and months and months at a time, would you pull up a file, pull up that PDF on your computer and see a 2-page resume and think to yourself, yes, 2 pages. This resume is twice as good. Like, no, you're going to be like, oh, The only exception really is if you have more than 10 years of work experience. So if you are applying, say, for an executive MBA program, there does tend to be more leniency there, but try to keep it one page. Okay. Can you let me know if an applicant at age 37 is a good fit to top business schools in the US for full-time MBA? So, KP, the typical sort of 2-year MBA programs, unfortunately not. It's a very long story why. To be clear, it is less about your chronological age and more about the number of years of work experience that you have. And that is because one of the biggest stakeholders that business schools are beholden to is the corporate recruiters that come to campus. And so if a corporate recruiter is coming to campus and the corporation is interviewing 50, 100 students to pick for their analyst program or what have you, if the corporation is looking for people who are at a certain lower level of seniority, and someone's at a much higher, because presumably at 37 you're probably pretty advanced in your career in terms of senior. You're probably in a very senior management position at this point. So it's not a good fit, because why would you then go to business school to apply for a job that is several layers below where you are right now? That having been said, 1-year programs can be very good. In fact, there are a few 1-year programs that are specifically for high achieving people who are in the sort of 35 to 40s, 45 age range. The ones that immediately come to mind are the Stanford MSX program and the Sloan Fellows program, which exists both at MIT and at London Business School. That is a 1-year program that is kind of specifically geared towards people who are older, but who also have more seniority. So think about a 1-year program. And the other thing I started to say this and then I interrupted myself, is it's not just about your chronological age. It is more about your years of work experience. So sometimes people were perhaps in the military for many years, and they were busy. They were not able to really get the sort of experience that is relevant. Or the more common one for people who are in the mid to late 30s who are successful. These are people who, for example, spent 10 years in a MD PhD program. And so they're 37, but they just graduated. They've only been working for 5 years. So in that situation, that is sort of a much easier situation to explain. Another situation is, let's say someone was unable to attend college in their early 20s because of a family financial situation. And so they only just recently, let's say they graduated from college at age 32. And so now they have 5 years of experience. Then that does at least put them at the right sort of seniority and accomplishment level. But usually the rule of thumb is at age 37 for a typical 2-year MBA program, probably not the right fit. And it's not because the schools are ageist. It's just because, imagine, think about where you were 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago in your career. And now imagine being in a classroom filled with people who are 10 to 15 years younger than you. And one of the biggest benefits of business school is the network you build and the other students that you learn from. You're not going to feel like you're learning from these people. Just like a 25-year-old is not going to feel like they're learning a whole lot from a 16-year-old. You as a 37-year-old, if you're sitting in a classroom primarily full of 26-year-olds and 27-year-olds, you're probably not, you're going to be like, I'm in a very different place in my life. And so it's also just not a good experience for you. And also a school finally would not want you to take out, the top business schools in the US. They're expensive and scholarships are not easy to come by. And the default assumption is that you will be taking out significant student loans. So what's the equivalence? Somebody told me that, like, it's if you are from India, and I'm just sort of based on your name and based on the GMAT Club demographics. I know that a lot of GMAT Club watchers and listeners are from India. I think it's 1.5 crore is the cost in rupees. So it would be terrible if you took on 1.5 crore worth of loans to get this degree, and then you apply for all these jobs and the employers don't hire you, right? For the same reason that, a high school would not usually accept someone who's in their late 20s, right? There are different, these MBA programs are set up to handle a very specific type of applicant. However, the final thing I will say that might help you is if you are an entrepreneur and you say, okay, I just want to get the MBA to get better at entrepreneurship for my own company. This is for my own edification. I'm not going to take advantage. I'm not going to try to get a career services, consulting, banking, product manager at Amazon type of job, then you have a better shot. But even then, I would focus on the 1-year programs. And another one that I should have mentioned before was Columbia has a program called the J-Term program, where you do not do a summer internship. So it is a condensed program. They are more open to people who are either quite old or conversely quite young, but who have family business stories or entrepreneurship stories. Okay, next question. Is there a template for recording leadership, EQ, and challenges? I mean, the template, if you're asking if in ApplicantLab there is a template, yes, there is. There's an entire module called brainstorming where I ask you different questions to get you to start thinking about your own leadership. One of the things I notice quite a bit is that people they might think, oh, well, I'm not a manager. I don't have a management position. And since I'm not a manager, I don't have any leadership stories. But there are so many ways to prove leadership. Even if you are not formally in charge of other people, you can still show leadership. And so one of the things I try to do in the brainstorming module is I ask you questions to get you to think about, like, well, have you ever done this? Or maybe you've done this, to get you to think about it. And then that's in that module is where you will write down your leadership stories and then use those like the building blocks to try to write your essay. So that's the template. I mean, I built it. So like I think it's useful. What about having a job that requires constant long distance travel, which delayed GMAT prep? Antonio, unfortunately, lots of people in the applicant pool are doing GMAT prep and working. They are management consultants. In fact, management consultants usually have amongst the highest GMAT scores. So folks like that, it is really not, you're not going to get a lot of forgiveness there. Because if you are applying to business school because, a lot of people apply to business school with this kind of idea of like, I will one day be an entrepreneur that changes the world, or I will one day be a CEO of ExxonMobil, or whatever that is. I mean, CEOs are constantly traveling and constantly have to work a zillion hours a week. And so making the argument of like, well, I'm not that person right now, but I'm going to be 20 years from now. It doesn't hold as much water as the person who has a job where they were working a lot and working 100 hours a week and also were able to prep for the GMAT. So it's not, I mean, look, you can try to explain it, but also the other thing with the GMAT specifically is that the schools have to provide a class average GMAT score to the rankings, the Financial Times rankings, the US News and World Report ranking. So the act of, let's say your score is 50 points below the average. That means that if we're going to let in Antonio, we have to let in someone else who's 50 points above the average to balance out his score so that our school's average is still in the same place, and therefore we don't get punished in the rankings for it. So you're asking a lot of the school if you submit a lower GMAT score. This does not cover the people who only have a week because that's specifically the topic I'm supposed to be focused on here. If you've got more than a week, though, you happen to be watching this and you've got several months, consider switching to the GRE or look at schools that have the test waivers. You're probably better off. Actually, it's hard to get in with a test waiver, but it's actually, you might be better off versus showing them a really low score that then might kind of darken their, like, oh, that's really low. That's, you know what I mean? Like, it might be better to keep it mysterious. And I have found that lower GMAT scores, lower GRE scores tend to be more easily forgiven than lower GMAT scores, because again, that average GMAT score is a number that a lot of people will be like, oh, Stanford, yeah, 737. But if I ask the average person, not the average person, but people who are like really looking into this process, right? If I'm like, oh, what's the average GMAT for Stanford? They'll be like, oh, it's somewhere around 730, 740. And if I say to that same person, what's the average GRE score for Stanford? That tends to be more of a So it's actually good news for you. So if you have to submit a test and you're not a great test taker, consider taking that GRE instead. Okay. Nikhil Sharma used a lot of my advice and you drafted round one, waitlisted at Wharton, but got into Tepper. That's amazing. Nikhil, thanks for letting me know. That's wonderful. Congrats. And by the way, Nikhil, there's, in case you haven't seen it, at the bottom of the to-do list module, I've got stuff for waitlist. Wharton waitlist is going to be tough, to be honest, but it's a small percentage, but it's a greater than 0 percentage. So, but yeah, for waitlist, it's going to come down to mostly like, who else do we have in Nikhil's bucket, professional bucket? When we're sort of trying to craft that class, and if they already have, if everyone in your bucket that they made an offer to accepts that offer, and they don't need someone else from your competitive bucket, then it's not about you. Sometimes people get bummed out, like, what was it wrong? Was there something wrong with me? It's not about you. It's just more like, we already have 17 people in the class who do what Nikhil does. And if one of them turns us down, then we'll go to that bucket of the wait list. So, but there's still a chance. But either way, I love Tepper. Tepper is jumping up those rankings, and for good reason. So it is a great, great school. Nilima Yadav is asking, in a resume, how to show a smooth transition in career from art to MBA in finance in one page. So Nilima, I'm assuming that you're asking, you want to apply to business school in order to go from a career in art into a career in finance, right? So I'm thinking that maybe what you're asking is, okay, so then on my resume, which aspects of my job or career so far do I highlight? My very pragmatic advice here, Nilima, is to not mention that you want to work in finance in your MBA application. This is, remember that sort of career vision homework thing I was talking about? This would not go in the resume. If we think about, what do people need to be good at finance? They need to be very good at numbers and analysis, and they also need to be very good at building relationships. This is something that a lot of folks who are not familiar with the banking world, but who want to use the MBA to get into banking, a lot of them don't realize this, that what really separates the people who rise up in banking, it's not the people who are the best financial modelers. It's the people who are able to, and this is true for management consulting as well, it's the people who are then able to go out and then convince this one company that they should buy the other company and then do the merger, and that's where they win their fees. Or in management consulting, convince this one corporation that they should pay your management consulting firm $3 million for this big study, and then that's how they win their fees. So in terms of showing that you have what it takes to potentially become a great banker, if you don't have a lot of quant stuff to point to, the next best thing would be showing like relationship management or any sort of analytics. But the even better thing is to not even put that in your application at all, unless you have done the homework that I mentioned earlier, where you're like, actually, I have spoken to 7 other people who did pretty much what I did before business school. They went to your business school and now they're working in finance. Then in that case, great. You can totally then, but the onus is on you to be able to prove that. As a side note, some business schools have better career services for career switchers than others. So if you are looking to make a pretty big jump, I would look at UCLA is one of the ones that really comes to mind. A lot of people don't realize just how good their career services office is at helping people make big jumps. But for the purposes of your application, my goal right now is to get you accepted. Don't say it. That's a pretty big jump, Nilima, and I think that your best bet is to say that you want to work in arts management, on the business side of whatever it is you do now. So if you're a ballerina right now, you want to work on the business side of the ballet, the ballet company, or you want to work in the business office of the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra, or whatever that might be. That's just going to be an easier story to sell. And then once you get to business school, you don't have to do that at all. No one will care. Asher is asking, I'm having trouble with the essay topic. What do you bring to the class and community? Any advice on this? So Asher, the first 2 things that come, there are sort of 2 main buckets of things you can talk about here. One of those things is, and the simplest one is, what extracurricular activities have you done in the past? So if in college you were leading a club for people interested in tech careers, then it's a pretty easy argument to say, and I will do the same thing in business school, right? I'm going to join the tech club and I'm going to help people get tech careers out of business school, right? Business careers in the tech space out of business school. If there are any sort of parallels that you can draw with something you've done in the past that matches to an extracurricular activity at that school, that's the easiest thing. But the other thing you can talk about is, especially if you have had experiences at work that are unexpected, in terms of the level of responsibility that you've been given compared to other people. So let's say let's say we've got a couple of different oil and gas engineers who are in the applicant pool. And so everyone is doing, fluid dynamics and whatever it is you have to do with the pipes and the oil. But let's say one candidate had to do the very painful thing. The management, this is nobody's, everyone in management hates having to do this, had to do layoffs last year. And you had to lay people off and you had to decide who was going to lose their jobs. And then you had to deliver the bad news to them. That is something that is not common in that job. And it is also something that is a very difficult management thing for people to learn how to do. So in that case, what you bring to the class is you could say, here's what I want you to think about. Think about what is something that I've done that will be useful or interesting to the careers of people in my business school class who come from radically different backgrounds. So in your business school class, there are going to be other engineers, but there are going to be doctors, elementary school teachers, management consultants, finance folks, people from the music industry, people from the pharmaceutical industry, people from real estate, right? So your knowledge of, again, let's assume you're an oil and gas, your knowledge of like fluid dynamics and storage of LNG, none of that's going to matter to any of those people. But if you say, yeah, actually last year I had to make the difficult decision to lay people off. That's a lesson where if you share that lesson in the classroom, everyone in that class is going to benefit from it. Because everyone in that class, unfortunately, at some point might have to do the same thing when they become managers in their respective fields. So I think if you're trying to narrow it down, I think that that's a good way to think about it. Like what experiences do I have that either A, make me stand out in terms of other folks in my competitive bucket again, or what things have I done in the past that are like useful for my other classmates who are coming from completely different industries. Okay, sorry, I had to take a little sip of tea. Can the GMAT compensate for a lower GPA? Please reply. You're reminding me, Avinash, you're reminding me of one of my favorite movies where Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Check it out. There's a person who's like trapped in a tower and they write this rescue note and it's like, please come and rescue me. Anyway, I always get a laugh out of it. So your message is reminding me of that. Please reply. So, okay, Avinash, yes, a GMAT can absolutely compensate for a lower GPA. Absolutely. Because why? Well, it's a standardized test. And the beauty of the standardized test is that it's standard. So you might have a 2.5 GPA from your bachelor's, right? But maybe you went to this like insanely difficult college. Maybe you chose to major in something that was insanely difficult. And if you would have taken the easier route, you would have had a 3.9. Maybe something really challenging happened to you while you were getting your degree. There are so many variables that go into someone's college experience that makes the GPA an unreliable indicator. Obviously, a good GPA is great, but smart people can get, and hardworking people can get low GPAs for a variety of reasons. Maybe they had to work to support their education. There's so many that anyway, I'm not going to go off on the list of all the things, but the beauty of the GMAT is that it's literally standardized. So if you go to a test center and you take the 3-hour GMAT exam, it's going to be the same experience that someone in any other country going to any other test center or doing it online is going to have. So and they're going to get the same types of questions and the same types of challenges in that test. So what's great about standardized tests for people who have low GPAs is that since everyone has the same experience when they approach that test, it's the best way to prove to them that you can hang with the other people intellectually in that class. That you're not gonna. They don't have to worry about you failing out of school. They don't have to worry about you like the other kids the other students in the class being like, what's this guy's problem? Like he never says anything smart. What an admissions mistake. They don't need to worry about that because you can prove to them that you're smart because you did very well by taking the standardized test that everyone else took. So, look, 2.5, not great. 3.2 in grad school is also not great just because the general rule of thumb is that grad school is supposed to be pretty easy for grades. Usually people get pretty strong grad school grades. But again, there are all kinds of reasons why maybe you didn't. And so, yes. In fact, if you have the option to take like a GMAT waiver, I wouldn't do it. people like you should absolutely take that test because it's going to be your lifeline to prove intellectual capacity. All right. Thank you, Maria, for your time. Thank you, GMAT Club, for having me and for proposing that I talk about this unconventional topic. It was a fun challenge for me to think about. Wow, what would I tell someone if they only had a week to apply? So best of luck for everyone. And I was in such a hurry to get through everything that I didn't even talk about myself. So I'm Maria. I went to HBS, and my website is ApplicantLab.com. It is a self-guided tool. So if you only have a week, it's actually kind of good for you because you don't have to wait to like, oh, I have to get on a call with an admissions consultant. Like, no, you can go through all of the stuff yourself and pull that all-nighter and at least try to maximize your chances with the time that you have left. That's ApplicantLab.com. Uh, Thank you, everyone, and best wishes for your application journey. Bye.